Today on Understanding Immigration, Biden's disastrous border policy's role in increasing child abuse.
What's fueling the surge of illegal aliens now in this border crisis? What's going on here?
It's about catch and release. If you tell the entire world that if you come to our borders illegally, doesn't matter how you get here, that we're going to process and release you in the United States and never to be heard from again. Shocker, they're going to come. The reality is what they're really doing on the front end, CBP, they're ensuring that the unaccompanied minor has not been trafficked, right? That's really the most important thing, and that's the crux of what TVPRA tried to do. But then it all breaks down from there, especially on this administration.
Well, isn't that because the smugglers use it, knowing they're going to be released?
That's exactly right.
So basically a law that says we don't want kids trafficked is creating the incentive to smuggle them.
That's exactly right. And what happens is, once they're in the United States, they become victims of trafficking.
Coming to you from Washington, D.C., you are now listening to FAIR's Understanding Immigration Podcast.
Americans all across the country are seeing our border collapse, and we've heard about many issues associated with that, from human trafficking, smuggling of fentanyl, kidnapping, the list goes on. And today we're going to focus a little bit more on the trafficking of children who are coming across the border. We've seen a skyrocketing number of unaccompanied minors, as it's called. And so today we're going to focus on children and understanding the laws that have led to the problems. Especially, we're going to zero in on the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, TVPRA, William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it's been around since 2000. It got amended in 2008. And it was also subject to a legal settlement that has ultimately produced the kind of fraud and manipulation that we see now. And the number of unaccompanied minors has skyrocketed, certainly under the Biden administration. And joining me to talk about this specific aspect of it is Mark Morgan, former head of Customs Border Protection, and he has been also a senior fellow with FAIR for some time and doing a fabulous job for the organization. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Well, you know, the Biden border crisis, which is a man-made disaster done intentionally by overt sabotage of our nation's institutions, has led to a dramatic spike in the number of what they call unaccompanied alien children, or UACs. These are people who show up at the border. They don't seem to have a parent in this country, and they're not with a parent when they come across the border, and they've been skyrocketing since January 2021. Let's see what happened in January 2020. Let me think about that one. Oh, I know. Biden came in, right. During each full month of the Trump administration, so we only saw an average of about 4,000 UACs a month, whereas now under the Biden administration, we're seeing 13,000 or more apprehensions. That's a 333% increase. So clearly, there has been a policy change that has prompted these dramatic increases. Total UAC apprehensions between ports of entry jumped from 30,000 in fiscal year 2020 to 144,000 in 21, and now 150,000 in last year, 2022. And these figures, they don't even account for the children among the 1.2 million known gotaways. These are folks who enter without inspection. Border Patrol can't find them, can't catch them. So because of these laws we currently have, influx turns the Border Patrol into a primary caregiving operation, babysitting, changing diapers, Huggies, and all that, diverting resources that allows the fentanyl to get trafficked while they're distracted. So, Mark, what's fueling the surge of illegal aliens now in this border crisis? What's going on here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on, Dan, but specifically to try to put it in ways that folks can just understand, because you don't have to be a border security expert or rocket scientist to understand what's going on. It's about catch and release. And right now, if you tell the entire world that if you come to our borders illegally, doesn't matter how you get here, that we're going to process and release you in the United States and never to be heard from again. Shocker, they're going to come. Now, there are a multitude of, immigration laws that are weak and ambiguous and allows the cartels to exploit. TVPRA, again, is one of those that you mentioned. The Flores Settlement Agreement is another one that has really added to our inability to address the illegal immigration crisis and then our border security. But make no mistake, if you enforce the law, if you apply consequences, if you have policies that deter illegal immigration, you're going to see it go down and our borders are going to be more secure. And that's exactly what we saw in the Trump administration. That's exactly what we did.
Right. So, I mean, we're not detaining, and we have these huge backlogs in the courts that incentivize people coming in and making fraudulent claims, which are accommodated by the Biden administration, lets them come in. We don't have bed space, and Biden administration has not been asking for more funding for bed space. The whole asylum system is broken down. It's turned into a massive highway for illegal immigration. Overall, reduced interior immigration enforcement is non-existent now, right?
That's
it's really
right.
gone. Like we have this Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE. They don't do anything.
That's right, Dan. But some of that stuff we're talking about, like on the back end, after they've already been a process into the country. So yes, we need more bed space. But before we get to that, what we should be doing is deterring, right? So that's the issue. Why do we need more bed space? Well, because they're not deterring. Their policies are encouraging and facilitating. Therefore, it requires more, facilities and more stuff on the back end. Our position was, well, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be reactive. We should be proactive and deter it. And that's why, like, for example, the Remain in Mexico program, it acted as a deterrence, right? Because we were no longer catching and releasing them into the United States. So we didn't need more bed space because by February of 2020, we had reduced illegal immigration by 85%. The deterrence factor, so it required less of the back end in the interior of resources and extra things that we needed. Again, because we were actually applying the law, we were actually deterring those from illegally entering.
I mean, do you think as Americans we unduly complicate the whole immigration question?
We do.
I mean, isn't it a matter of if you don't play by the rules, you don't play the game?
It's that simple, Dan. It really is. And that's why, look, there's a lot of complicated policy and law and things that are happening right now. But at the end of the day, that's really what it's about. And it's the same thing when we're talking about unaccompanied minors. It's pretty straightforward, right? Is that all we're saying is if you want to come to the country, you come in legally, you apply for a valid asylum claim, and then you go from there. That's not what we're seeing. That's not what's happening under the Biden administration. It's why we have 1.4 million known gotaways. The chief just last week said it's probably 20% higher, so we're looking at 1.7 million total gotaways. But again, when it comes to unaccompanied minors, the TVPRA, which was designed, right, the lofty goals, right? It was designed to actually address kids that were being trafficked. But it's had completely the opposite impact.
It all started back in the 90s during the Clinton administration.
Correct.
When there was a lawsuit brought, I guess, by the ACLU and others.
Yep.
And the Clinton administration decided to settle that case in what's called the Flores decision.
Right.
And that really was something that then got enshrined into the law during the Bush administration at the end of W's term,
right,
second term. But then the big problem became in 2008.
That's right.
And the fingerprints on that, surprisingly enough, not only Dianne Feinstein, but Senator Joe Biden,
right,
who was one of the primary sponsors in the Senate who pushed those amendments.
That's right. So it really, the whole TVPRA, as you said in the opening, it started around 2000, and then you had the Flores Settlement agreement that came up.
The settlement happened before that.
Correct.
It was 2008 was then amended.
Right. That's right.
Incorporated the Flores Settlement.
That's right. And so what happened was, and this is where we can get a little complicated, but basically the Flores Settlement agreement said, if you're a family, and then they reinterpreted that to apply to unaccompanied minors. So for all sake purposes, so if you're a family or unaccompanied minor, the Flores Settlement Agreement said that even if you illegally enter, the government cannot keep you for longer than 20 days. It's impossible to get through any immigration proceeding in 20 days. It's very, very difficult.
The government can't do anything in 20 days except seize your assets.
That's right. I have a hard time. I think they can't even get out of their driveway in 20 days. So the reality is that's what started to really catch and release. Right, and because we couldn't keep you, so families, unaccompanied minors, you were caught and you were released, and then TVPRA in 2008 was really codified. They codified elements of the Florida Settlement Agreement specifically for unaccompanied children. But here's
you have to be illegal, you have to be under 18, and there's no parent or guardian in the U.S. that they can find to take custody. Right, so then they get a certain short period of time to figure out what to do with you. Right, and they have to decide whether or not you're a trafficking victim, or whether or not you're an asylum seeker or what have you. You get 48 hours to make that determination. Right. And then what?
The reality is, though, that's not all applied. Right. The reality is what they're really doing on the front end, CBP, they're ensuring that the unaccompanied minor has not been trafficked. Right. That's really the most important thing. And that's the crux of what TVPR tried to do. But then it all breaks down from there, especially on this administration.
Well, isn't that because the smugglers use it, knowing they're going to be released?
That's exactly right.
So basically a law that says we don't want kids trafficked is creating the incentive to smuggle them.
That's exactly right. And what happens is, and we can talk about this in a minute, what happens is after they're smuggled in and they're in the United States, oftentimes, then once they're in the United States, they become victims of trafficking. And that's what I mean by this TVPRA has actually done the opposite of what it was trying to prevent. It's actually incentivized and created more trafficking than less. But here's how it goes. Unaccompanied minor comes in, Border Patrol, CBP, they look at them and they say, okay, they're not a victim of trafficking. Now what this TVPRA says is that you've got 48 hours, process them as fast as you can, turn them over to HHS, which also has the mandates then to process them and find them a sponsor anywhere in the United States and get them out. And once they find a sponsor,
is the least restrictive setting in the best interest of the child.
And what's been interpreted,
and they don't know who those sponsors are. For
that's
the most
exactly
part,
right.
So they wind up going into actually more harm.
Many of them, and that's exactly right, Dan. And their interpretation of least restrictive means, especially this administration, that just means process them as fast as humanly possible to reduce the bad optics of kids being in overcrowded facilities. But here's the reality. And they also, and I heard the Secretary of HHS this week in testimony say how they vet sponsors. Dan, it's a joke. It's a freaking joke. Here's how they vet sponsors. They run a quick United States NCIC check, wants and warrants. And the sponsor,
that's the criminal background data check for our listeners.
Correct. That's right. And so basically, if they're not wanted or been convicted of a crime, then they'll release the kid to anybody. That's the reality.
No matter how old they are.
No matter how old they are. And right now, county, so you read the numbers that included 21 and 22. If you include the first 4 or 5 months of 23, so far in the first 25 months of this administration, there have been almost 350,000 unaccompanied minors come to our borders.
And they're losing them.
And that's
this
another
sounds
thing.
like the child porn industry supply
it is.
legislation.
It is, because here's the reality is again, they're releasing the sponsors who they have not done actual thorough vetting. I mean, you could have an illegal alien known gang member, as long as they haven't been convicted of a crime, they can be a sponsor. And here's another thing that happens. Once HHS releases them to a sponsor, they basically say, hey, we're done. We're done. And so they don't do home visits. They have no idea the condition of the home, who else is living in the home that the sponsor now is taking the kid. I mean, HHS, they haven't conducted 350,000 home visits.
Do we know how many people at HHS are responsible for follow-up monitoring?
Exactly.
Hundreds of thousands of these kids?
Exactly. I don't know the number, but I can tell you it's not enough, right? They can't. They physically cannot.
More than two?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, seriously, 350,000. We know HSS, they are not doing 350,000 home visits on a regular basis. You know what they consider follow-up is 30 days after they've released an unaccompanied minor to a sponsor, they give them a phone call. That's what they call backup. They give them a phone call, and right now we just learned that up to at least 20% they've lost track of, meaning that 30-day follow-up phone call that HHS is supposed to do, they'll call the sponsor doesn't answer. They have no idea.
Biden was involved in the 2008 amendment. Since he's taken office, the number of unaccompanied minors I mentioned in FY21 was 150,000.
Yep.
That's a 15 times increase in the number since 2008.
Yep.
Now, wouldn't you think Biden would look at that and go, you know what? Maybe what we did had the contrary outcome. Maybe what we did maybe we had good intentions, but something was wrong. What is incomprehensible is in the face of, I know Dianne Feinstein's lost her marbles at this point, but in the face of evidence that something they wanted to do isn't working, there's no response to it.
Here's what I'll say. So you gave the 140,000 or so in 21, is 152,000 in 22, and FY23 is on pace to exceed that.
Skyrocketing. Again,
350,000 unaccompanied miners in 25 months.
It's a hockey stick.
It is. It's blown every single stat in our lifetime. Here's the issue, though, Dan. He already knew it. Right? So he knew an issue when he was vice president under Secretary Jay Johnson. Remember, Secretary Jay Johnson said 1,000 illegal aliens a day is a bad day. So he knew about it as vice president. He knew about it as senator. And what I will say is during the transition, we gave Biden's transition team over 200 briefings just from DHS. The overwhelming majority of them were on the border security issues. We talked to his transition team about this very issue. We've talked about TVPRA, as we're talking about right now. We talked about how actually it's incentivizing and facilitating kids to be trafficked more so than to reduce it as the law supposedly was intended to do. He knew all that, and he knows it. He's ignored it. just like they've ignored every single piece of effective border security policy, legislation, tools, and resources. He's ignored it. It's intentional. And so when you see kids, and we've heard recently about kids being thrown into horrible labor trafficking issues, sex trafficking,
enslavement.
It's right. It's on Biden's hands. He knows this. Make no mistake. This isn't about ignorance or incompetence. This is all being done intentional.
Well, if we were going to amend the TVPRA, right? I mean, there have been some attempts, right?
It's good
Jason Chaffetz, Goodlatte, yeah. Cornyn, who usually is not very good on the issue.
No, agree.
Henry Cuellar, they've tried to introduce some legislation. No support from the administration. And I guess they always say, well, you do anything like this, you're going to weaken protections or something along those lines. But it's hard to imagine that they would actually want to see kids put in danger in this way.
That's exactly right.
Parents are abandoning their children just knowing they think they're going to have maybe a better life, or maybe they'll join them some years down the line when they come illegal. Maybe they think there's a relative who will eventually find them somewhere in the United States.
That's the tragedy, Dan. And but look, this same issue applies to all illegal aliens, right? So this administration, Open Border Advocates and Secretary Mayorkas, they want to put off a false narrative, basically a lie to the American people, that their policies are safe, orderly, and humane. It's a lie. It's the opposite. And when it comes to unaccompanied minors, the best thing that we can do for unaccompanied minors is deter them from making the journey. We know that up to, Doctors Without Borders has said up to 30% of young women and children are sexually assaulted on their journey up here. Think about that. So now when you've increased the number of UACs by 350%, you've just increased the number of minors that are being sexually assaulted and raped by 350%. We know under this administration, they have recovered over 1,500 dead bodies, including unaccompanied minors on the border physically. 1,500.
Isn't it interesting the media have so little interest in that?
So little.
They were, straining all over, a couple of people that were separated in the Trump administration.
I was there when I was commissioner. There was a young father and his son that was found face down in the Rio Grande River, and that's all the mainstream media talked about for probably a week, and that was horrific. And guess what? We should be talking about that. But guess what we were trying to do? Every day I woke up trying to prevent that. And how do you prevent that? From deterring them from making the journey.
So basically we need an amendment.
Yes.
We need an amendment or a bill in Congress that specifically overturns
Flores and TVPRA.
Settlement,
yep.
And basically says if you're an unaccompanied minor who's sent over by your parents, abandoned intentionally, what happens? What should happen to the child?
We still screen them, and this is what a lot of people they're not being honest. They'll say, well, if you get rid of TVPRA, then there's going to be no protection for a child that's being trafficked. No, we didn't say get rid of TVPRA or its intentions. What we said is yes. So let's still maintain the ability to evaluate, have they been trafficked on their journey to our border? But if they've been determined not to have been trafficked, then as a nation, we should do everything we can to reunite them with their parents in their home country. We're doing the opposite now. I traveled to all 3 Northern Triangle countries, as example, as a commissioner, and I reached across and I looked at my counterparts and leaders of these countries, and all of them said to me, Dan, independently, Mark, Commissioner Morgan, why are you keeping the future of our country? Will you please send our kids back home? I mean, it was powerful and and it's that simple. So if we find they haven't been trafficked, what we should do as a government is do everything we can to work with their home country and reunite their kids back to their home country. That's what's in best interest of the child. That's what's in best interest of the family. And keep in mind, TVPRA, which was even more ridiculous, is if you're an unaccompanied minor from Canada or Mexico, what I just described is what we do. We evaluate you if you haven't been trafficked and there's no potential for you to be persecuted if we send you back. If you're from Mexico or Canada and you're an unaccompanied minor, we reunite you with your family. If you're a minor from anywhere else in the country, we keep you. It doesn't make any sense.
And you also have special rules under asylum where you don't have to apply within a certain period of time if you're a minor who came in as a minor. So therefore you can dilly-dally around for a long time without making a claim of persecution or fear of being returned, right?
That's it. The reality is,
so
especially
you can make
under this
that
administration,
defensive claim years later.
That's exactly right. So the reality is, under this administration, is you come in, you process, you're given a sponsor, and you'll never be heard from again. And there's no attempt to really track you, find you, and et cetera. That their whole goal is to process and release as fast as possible. And then they feign like they have no idea why we've seen this 350% increase in unaccompanied minors. Again, right now, and this is important for the viewers and listeners, is there are untold numbers of unaccompanied minors that are smuggled through Mexico into our borders. Smuggled. They haven't been trafficked yet. right? Here's the just atrocity is that there's, again, we don't know how many, but we know it happens, but the numbers are astronomical, is once they've entered our system is when then they become trafficked. That's the tragedy here. And that's what this administration and Secretary Mayorkas and all the open border advocates are not being honest with the American people. The reality is, Dan, as you described a minute ago, there are countless unaccompanied minors that go through this process. They find a sponsor, they find a home, and the sponsor takes off with them, right? They're not cornered with DHS. DHS has no idea where they're at, and that's where then they become trafficked, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and that's happening every single day in this country.
So the major obstacles to reform, what would you say they are?
Congress. So
just Congress?
Yeah, look, that's absolutely right. Congress.
Where do the American people go? Our listeners want to change this. They want to stop it.
Right. So what they need to do is grassroots efforts, get to the local congressmen, right? Get to the representatives, get to their senators and say, do your job. Coalition letter. Last year, and FAIR was a leader of this, is we got several conservative think tanks together and we developed a coalition letter, really the first of its kind. And we laid out a roadmap of what needs to be done to secure our borders and address the illegal immigration issues. TVPRA, amending TVPRA, was a top priority. And as you said, Dan, it's already been tried. It was already part of the good years ago. So what's frustrating for me is Congress knows what they need to be done for a while, for a couple of decades. They refuse to do it. Keep in mind, you and I were talking about this before. Now, look, yes, Democrats have caused this unmitigated crisis, the worst in our time. But now it's time for the Democrats to fix it. And where are they at? Because remember, even under Donald Trump, the Republicans had the House and the Senate.
It's time for the Republicans to fix it.
Exactly. Because look, remember, even under Donald J. Trump, he had the Republicans had the White House, the House, and the Senate.
Years.
2 wasted years.
Paul
Dan.
Ryan.
Yep, 2 wasted years. And so now
we've seen this playbook before.
That's right. So here we've had 2 years. 2 years. The Republicans have been going after the Democrats that they created this crisis, justifiably so, and I agree they have. For 2 years, they've been saying it's got to be fixed. They even came up with a commitment to America where they said we must have strong borders. They ran on it during the campaign. The American people listened to them and said, okay, Republicans, we hear you. We'll give you back the House. Now, here we are. I mean, we're getting close to April, and we still haven't seen a single piece of meaningful legislation out of the House come to the floor for a vote. Where is it?
Well, we'll have to keep the pressure on and do what we can to try to convince folks. But people like Jim Jordan or Mark Green, they have relevant committees here. I think there are strong voices in favor of doing something about this. And folks need to let Speaker McCarthy know how they feel about this because, again, how many more times do people expect to go to the polls and vote on the basis of promises only to see no action, right?
That's right.
I mean, this is a critical situation. It could not be more dire at this point. The whole border situation is getting to the point of an existential crisis for the future of the country. Obviously, China's sending people across the country who across that border. We don't know what their intentions are. We see now frequently known terrorists and people on the terror watch list are being apprehended. Imagine the ones that are getting through. It's a very serious situation. And a big part of that is what we were talking about today, which is the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. This needs to change.
TVPRA, it's got to change, Dan. And look, we haven't even talked a lot about the family side of this. And the reality is because the Flores Settlement Agreement impacted both families and unaccompanied minors. And you said the Flores Settlement Agreement in 2008 codified what was pre-established in the Flores Settlement Agreement for unaccompanied minors. But what we also have involving kids are fake families, right? So we have kids, literally when I was there, we had kids that were being bought and rented and sold to form fake families because, again, under the Flores Settlement Agreement, if you came to our border as a family, boom, automatic passport in the United States. You weren't detained, you were released, never be heard from again.
And by the way, that same judge, Dolly G. has refused repeatedly to revisit this settlement and reauthorize, even though she sees the chaos it's created.
She knows it, and we told her time and time again. And this is why Congress has to step in, and this is why look, we have to put pressure on the Republicans now to do what they know that needs to be done. So we need not just a fix of TVPRA, but we have to have a fix of the Flores Settlement Agreement. As you said, Dan, it's not complicated. First, we deter. And how do we deter? Well, we tell them if you come to our border illegally and you file a fraudulent claim, which the majority of them are, we know they're economic migrants, we're either going to detain you as you go through your process or we're going to remove you to Mexico as you go through your process. Dan, I promise you, if we do that, you will see illegal immigration drastically reduced within a couple of weeks. Why? Because we have now deterred them from the one thing they want, which is what? To be released in the United States. Exactly what this administration is doing. They've sent a beacon out to the entire world, families, unaccompanied minors, everybody. Come to our borders. Doesn't matter how valid your claim is, we're going to process and release you in the United States.
And now they're trying to get around the optics of the border crossings by paroling people in, flying them in at night, illegally using parole, by the way.
That's right. They've legalized otherwise illegal activity.
But in the end, if Congress did change the law and mandated this stuff, what's to prevent the Biden or a similar administration from just ignoring the law again?
Yeah, so Dan, I think that's a spot-on question. And here's my response. First of all, I think the answer to that is they're not. They've shown again and again. We have a secretary right now of a major department in the United States. For the first time,
Mayorkas?
Yeah, Mayorkas, Secretary Mayorkas. For the first time, secretaries come in and said, you know what? Those little things called laws that Congress passed, no.
Advisory opinions.
I'm going to steal that. I think that's right. Advisory opinion. That's right. He chooses which laws he's going to enforce, which he's not. And he actually is making up new law. Right. And then he's directing his own personnel that have the statutory responsibility to enforce the law to not enforce it.
Right.
I mean, we've never seen this before. So
it's his own brand of spray paint.
That's exactly right. And so I think you're right. So even if Congress does pass these laws, I think what's going to happen is that they're not going to enforce them. But guess what? That's why it's so important for 2024, though. So let's get everything set now. Let's get the roadmap in place, and let's get it going back. So when we have a president in 2024 that really understands the importance of border security,
if you want to know who you ought to be looking at and who you might want to be president in 2024, look at who the left-wing media is attacking most aggressively, and that's all you need to know.
Right. And who also has a track record of proven providing a network of tools, policies, and authorities that really led to the most secure border.
What is it with the left's obsession with mass immigration, this mass migration mania, to try to get people into the country as fast as possible by hook or crook, legally or illegally? What is this mania?
Look, there's two things, and you can draw no other conclusion because, again, we have to ask that question in terms of this is not through incompetence. This is intentional, is that they see a perceived political benefit. And I think there's really two avenues. One is illegal aliens, remember, are counted as part of the census. So there's a very real redistricting possibility that would go in favor of the Democrats. And then they're playing the long game as well, as they believe every single illegal alien they find a pathway to citizenship is going to equate to a Democratic vote. I think they're...
Wait, this pathway to citizenship is it's a formality. They just go through motor voter and check the box. They've got their voter registration card.
That's right.
And now Democrats want to enfranchise what they call non-citizens, illegal aliens, citizens of other countries.
Yep.
Right? So what does citizenship mean to the Democrats anymore?
Nothing. I mean, it's completely blurred. I mean, they're calling people who illegally enter and file a false claim and they release non-citizens. They're actually attaching the word citizens when the statutory definition of what it described is called an illegal alien. I mean, this is all part of the systematic process that they're trying to change the narrative, and they're basically lying to the American people. Look, our secretary, our vice president, our press secretary of the White House, and the president has all for the past 2 years blatantly lied to the American people and told them again and again that our borders are secure and we have operational control. So,
do we think that Tuberville and Chip Roy, they have a bill, but these things basically say that the DHS secretary can suspend the entry.
Yep. HR 29.
But why would Mayorkas do that he has the power already to suspend the entry under emergency conditions? Why would that change anything?
Well, actually, it codifies it and it takes it out of the hands and authority of CDC and gives that authority to the secretary. So keep in mind, though, we're hopeful for a short game, but this is a long game. This is about giving and setting up the next president and Congress for success, getting a president that's actually going to enforce the law and secure the border. That's why it's so important that like HR 29 gets passed, because, again, it gives the authority to the secretary, takes it out of CDC.
That's the Chip Roy bill.
That's the Chip Roy bill. But so that's one. But a second and very important part of the Chip Roy bill, Dan, is that what it says is you either, if someone comes across illegally, it goes back to what I was saying, you either detain them if you don't have the capacity to detain them, this is why I'm not for just giving unfettered money to just have a million a bed space. Is that we should deter. So what it says is, if you don't have the capacity to detain them while they're going through their immigration proceedings, then you remove them to Mexico like an MPP style program. That's what his bill says. And you have Representative Gonzalez, who is out there, who is blatantly lying to his constituents and lying to the American people about what H.R. 29 does and doesn't do. He has said that it's anti-American, it's anti-Christian, because it removes...
Anti-Christian?
Yeah, anti-Christian. His words, quote, because it denies people from claiming asylum. It's a lie. That's not what the bill does. Well, what it does is applies deterrence.
He needs a little education.
He does.
But it really boils down to two words: detention and dockets. If
detention and removal,
available, and dockets. The point is, if courts are so backlogged, and you can't detain them until during the pendency of the case because the dockets are so overcrowded, the whole thing falls apart.
It does, and
Everything falls apart.
Yep.
And obviously, we don't have detention space because the J6 defendants are taking it all up.
That's for a whole nother podcast, right? So what we did do, we did just that under the Trump administration, right? So we were detaining people, and or if we didn't have the capacity to detain them, we were moving them to Mexico under MPP. Guess what happened? We only enrolled about 60,000 or so in MPP. And people always say, see, look, it wasn't even that effective. You only enrolled 60,000. Well, the reason why it was so effective,
we only
coming. Exactly, Dan.
Look, detention
500,000 less came.
Or out. Detention or out. That's all it is. All
That's
right.
it.
Well, on that note, because we're running over time here, for those who have listened all the way through, I congratulate you. I'm Dan Stein with Mark Morgan. Thanks for joining me. We had a good time, and this is an important issue, and I hope folks will take action because this cannot continue. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Dan.